things at the lunch hour instead. And that, of course, you have to have a lunch hour. Not everybody's in a union like I am, so they don't always have that lunch hour, I'm afraid. So we'll see who can come in, and people may have to come and go, but we understand that. Usually we do these things more at the end of the day. But we are very lucky to have two great speakers with us today. One of the goals here is to talk about what I think is absolutely the central issue of our time, which is how working people, the working class, the labor movement, how those relate to the whole question of militarization, war and peace. Obviously, climate is another equally existential question, but I actually think the labor movement's done a lot of work on climate, that the labor movement has embraced that much more than people had expected. So while that's not perfect, there's a lot more going on there. I think in the area of war and peace, we have a very big gap. And so, particularly in the United States. So I think it's great to have with us today someone who really has a perspective on the European side of that, as well as another speaker who has a great internal perspective on that in the US and in Massachusetts. So one of the goals here is that people really think about what they want to do about this, and that we continue this work after this webinar, that people, let us know in the chat or let us know when they're speaking that they want to keep working on this or what they are doing about this question, as well as asking questions about how to act on this question in a productive, efficacious way. It's very important. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers and hear from them, and then we will have open things up to discussion. We are very lucky today to have Peter Mertens with us from Belgium, from the Belgian Workers' Party. He is a leader of the Belgian Workers' Party since 2008 and is currently the general secretary of that party, one of the parties that really represent working class people and their interests. He's also been in the parliament in what they call the Chamber of Representatives there since 2019. And he's also been a municipal councillor in Antwerp since 2000 and I believe it's 2013. So has experience in actually governing as well as running a movement. So he has written several books. The most recent, which I found very interesting, is called Mutiny: How Our World is Tilting. That's from last year. It struck me in two ways. One is I think I learned for the first time in my life where the term strike comes from. He pointed out that the sailors in the British Navy mutinied by striking the sails. In other words, saying we won't work, and you strike the sails. And it's from since that time when somebody goes on strike, that's actually the reference point, whether they know it or not. I found that fascinating, being a sort of fan of British, working class activism in the Navy. Going back to like Mutiny on the Bounty, that kind of thing. The other thing is he starts the book talking about the National Health Service in England and health workers in general, and of course as a executive director of the Service Employees International Union in Massachusetts. That's most of our workers are those workers. So I was reading about my everyday experience as a labor organizer and a labor activist. So I really appreciate that, and you will all appreciate the book too. Our second speaker, I'll just say who he is now, is Carlos Aramayo, who is the president of Unite Here Local 26, which is the hospitality workers in the Boston area, but all the way down to Rhode Island. And Carlos also serves as a vice president of the Massachusetts AFL-CIO and is active in his national union as well. Just got back from Europe, in fact, so he's gotten a taste of the world Peter's speaking from. And he also, has done organizing all across the United States. So he doesn't just have Massachusetts experience. He's organized in, casino workers, for example, and hotel and industrial food service workers, and in places like Florida, Connecticut, Nevada, as well as Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So we really have two excellent points of view on things here. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Peter, to give us your perspective on things.
Okay, thank you, Harris. Thank you for having me. So I will try to say something about the situation in Europe. First of all, I have to point out that like our party, the last 10, 15 years, we were waging campaigns around socio-economic themes, mainly like the energy bills, like the pension question. There is a general strike movement at this year. It will continue in September, October about pensions, like healthcare issues. So we were more involved in the socio-economic themes. And since 2 years, we said, okay, it's too narrow for us. There will be a huge leap towards militarization. And so we were discussing how to introduce this theme of militarization and war into the trade union movement, into the protest movement. You have to know also the big peace movements of the 60s, 70s, 80s. They don't exist anymore in general in Europe. Of course, they do exist at some extent, but in the 80s, against armament race, there were still like in Brussels, there was the biggest manifestations ever with 400,000 participations, but it died out. Only this generation still is active. So we have to rebuild the peace movement, and there's advantages of this because we have to rebuild, and disadvantages. We have the discussion about nostalgia all the time, like people saying back in the day this, back in the day that, and we say, okay, nostalgia can also be an enemy. Let's build it from scratch on with new generations of trade union activists and peace activists. So that's a little bit the frame in which we try to reconstruct. Now in Europe, there's two big things, like discussions about war and militarization. On one hand, of course, the militarization process launched by the European Union and European Commission, and on the other hand, the question of the genocide against the Palestinians. And they are not spontaneously linked. So I will tell a little bit about it. First of all, you have, of course, the militarization discussion in the European Union and Commission. 800 billion of euros should be invested in the next decade in Europe to build a kind of NATO fit European new army. Most of it will be in the national level, meaning like in Germany, for example, they already decided this historical turn. In Europe also, you have to know, when you speak about Germany, most of the Europeans, not Germans, like my generation, we grew up with the idea, don't give weapons to Germans. It's a very bad idea. And this combination about Germany, chauvinism and militarization led, among others, to World War I, World War II. So there is still generations, and we see now that there is a big turn in Germany. For the first time, they are talking make Germany great again, make Germany kriegstüchtig, fit for war, etc. It's totally new after World War II, this discourse. And Germany is now rearming in a very, very fast way, and rearming military, but also ideologically, sending people from the army into the schools, totally new, making advertisements in football stadia, making advertisements on pizza boxes, totally new. For 75 years, we haven't seen that. And so that's the discussion. And like now there will be the new summit of NATO in Den Haag in June. And there Trump has said, okay, we will have to have a norm of 5% spending. And from that 5%, it will be 3.5% of hard spending on military budgets for every country in the European Union. And that's at stake. For our country, for example, we already doubled the military budget since 2007 from 4 billion euro towards 12 billion euro this year. And now they're saying, okay, you have to increase it with another 10 billion a year. For a small country as Belgium, it's huge. We are only 11 million people. It's huge. And there is an immediate link between this strike going on. It's not everyday strike, but striking movements. Like there is an action day every 2 months in Belgium, and there were already 3 general strike days. That's about the pensions. So there are measures taken by the right-wing government to make it more difficult to retire earlier. And so there's a big striking movement. But if there is this 3.5% norm of NATO coming in, it will be clear the pension system in Belgium and all over in Europe will be very hardly touched. And so now, in our point of view, we are trying to introduce the military team in this struggle that's going on. And to be quite honest, it is not spontaneously that one is making the link. So we are restarting to do it. I think for the first time now, the national-wide 2 main trade unions, the Christian Democratic and the Socialist Democrats, in their official stance, for the first time since 1 month, they take stance against this NATO norm. We worked on it for 2 years, behind the scene, etc. But it's not like everyone on the trade union level and everyone in society spontaneously make that link between the budget cuts, the situation of the pensioners, the situation of the health care system, etc. Our point of view is that if Trump is, because behind the scenes it's Trump that's really telling NATO that Europeans have to rearm themselves so that NATO can concentrate itself to the Indo-Pacific against China. I think that's the real goal. The Europeans must arm themselves so that the American money and the NATO money can be spent to the real enemy in the eyes of US imperialism, being China. But it will destroy social security systems. And in our opinion, we are at the beginning of this phase. So let's be clear, there is not, for the moment, one of the questions was, is there a big anti-war movement at this time in Europe? No, it is not. There's a lot of strikes, there's a lot of actions, etc. But on the NATO 3.5% norm, it's only the beginning phase. I think we will have in the next 2, 3, 4 years need to build up this counter force to do it. But there are possibilities. Our experience is if you make the link between, for example, the pension system and the militarization, it is possible. People ask themselves. There was a healthcare strike with 40,000 people on the national manifestation last week, and there was a lot of people saying, "Okay, you have that kind of money for the F-35, but you're cutting us in our hospital." So it is just a starting phase, but there is a lot of possibilities, we think, if we speak clearly about that. And then the second movement is about Palestine. There is in the big cities, in the industries that are most diverse, and where the most people from Arabic origin, there is a big movement going on. And there was, for example, in the airport of Brussels, there was actions against weapons to Israel, starting bottom up, starting from workers on the airport saying, okay, we won't we won't be complicit to genocide, we won't fill the planes with the boxes with arms, etc. And then the national-wide unions had to take a stance, and they said, okay, we won't participate at arming Israel. And that's a big movement going together with the student occupations, with the youth movement against the genocide. And what most of the people see on that level is there's a contradiction. The European Union took action against Russia very rapidly, military embargo, and towards Israel and genocides, there are no sanctions. So these double standards, there's a lot of discussion, very broad, There was a survey now, still in Belgium. I think it's all over in Europe. 80% of the people are against this genocidal genocide in 80% of the people are in Europe supporting Palestine. And so I will end with that, with this short introduction. We are also trying to introduce the Palestine solidarity movement into the trade union actions. So there is, on the one hand, the traditional struggle, socio-economic struggle. Then in that struggle, we try to introduce the question of the militarization, but also the Palestine solidarity movement. That's I think globally where we are in Europe, and there is a lot of discussions in the trade unions. I was in Germany last week about exactly that topic, how to link all these things together. But it's the starting phase of all. We are not along. We have still a long road to go to really link everything on a mass level, on a conscient level, that all these things are linked. So we are at the beginning phase of it all. Yeah, that's maybe it's better than afterwards responding in questions about specific situations in Europe, but I just wanted to give you this introduction.
Yeah, no, that's very good. I really appreciate it. I mean, you've sort of laid out two big opportunities, I would call them at this point. As you use the word yourself, as not realized, but the opportunity of linking the threat to the social security systems, the welfare state, you could call it, and militarization as a monetary, fiscal problem. And then on the other hand, this link between, double standard between Gaza and how we treat Russia, for example.
Maybe to add one more small
Yeah,
thing.
please.
There was also a lot of discussions in Europe. I know the situation in the US about, if you are discussing this, which perspective do you give? And then we said, okay, trade union movements are there and left-wing movements are there. You have to emancipate people, because if you say things the wrong way, you can organize depression. Because the world we're living in, with the genocide, the militarization, all the problems, and we say, and it's a big discussion, like in Europe, the trade union movement, neither the left movement has to organize depression. We have a lot of meetings everywhere in Europe, and if you were not depressed entering the meeting, you surely are depressed leaving the meeting, and that cannot be the goal of an emancipatory movement in our view. We are not naive, but in all this crisis that's there, we have also to see the opportunities to make people conscient about the situation. There are also, amidst the crisis, amidst all the problems, also opportunities.
No, thank you for that, because that is definitely a threat to the movement. Carlos, I turn it over to you now from the Boston and the United States perspective.
Sure. First of all, I just want to thank everyone and the organizers for putting this together. I think this is a really important discussion, and I think certainly from a labor movement perspective, you don't get a lot of opportunities to step back and kind of think more broadly about why you're doing what you're doing every day. As someone who runs a union, you do spend a lot of time running from crisis to crisis and issue to issue and problem to problem, and not reflecting on where are we trying to go and what are the big themes that we're trying to push on and move. And I did want to just start by really agreeing with what Peter just said. Harris said I just came from our Global Union Federation meetings in Geneva, and there was a joke after one of the sessions. We went into a coffee break, and folks were speaking from a European perspective, a North American perspective, a South American perspective with what's going on in Argentina. And the joke was like, who could be more depressed? Like, who could have the more depressing presentation of what's actually going on continent by continent? And I think Peter's really right. We want to be really cautious to not get into that dynamic, because you can leave scratching your head and drinking your espresso, and that's it, right? So I wanted to kind of offer, I know most of the people on this call live in the North American context. They're sort of living through the challenges every day that we're facing in the North American context. But I wanted to kind of offer a little bit of a broader perspective from a labor perspective in the United States, and then bring that back to, I think, some of these really important questions about the military industrial complex, its expansion, and its role that it plays in our daily lives. In preparing for this, I was thinking about, what are the kind of fundamental pieces of a union contract in the US? And those really are, in addition to having a voice at work, right, which is very important, the idea that you can bargain your conditions at work, it's really, wages, right? You want to be able to earn enough money to not have to worry every week about, are you going to be able to make the rent? It's healthcare, right? We don't have the benefit of a social democratic system that provides healthcare as a basic human right. And so we have to negotiate that into our contracts. It's our pensions, right, that we have to negotiate into our contracts. And also, I think in a lot of the better union contracts, certainly true here for Local 26, we try to negotiate some sort of education advancement, right? The idea that our members don't stay in one place, but they should be able to move up through the industries that they're in as they spend their lifetimes in those industries. And I was thinking about this, and I think, at the end of the day, if, reflecting on those pieces of a contract, I think those are also the fundamental pieces of what I think many of us want to see a social contract have, right? Many of us really believe that that shouldn't be that those privileges should not be reserved for union members, but that should be, if one lives in the society and you're productive in the society and you're contributing to the society, that you should be guaranteed enough income to be able to afford a place to live. You should be guaranteed healthcare. You should be guaranteed a pension, and you should be guaranteed the ability to get educated and advance yourself and advance your family. I think that we are facing a major crisis in this country, and I believe the same is true in many places in Europe, as I had heard. We are facing a major crisis in this country that there is no social contract at all that actually addresses any of those things in a meaningful way. And in fact, neoliberalism, beginning, coming out of the Cold War, sort of coming out of the Reagan era into the Bush era, but really taking hold under Bill Clinton's administration. Like, let's all remind ourselves, Bill Clinton fired more federal workers than Elon Musk has, right? While he was president of the United States, right? A Democrat. And that neoliberalism has really, and the outsourcing of good jobs all around the world, the kind of turning of workers into consumers, like a whole set of things that kind of come with the oceanic tide of neoliberal politics and neoliberal economy, has really undermined any kind of social contract in any meaningful way in this country. And that has come hand in hand with this new form of militarism, right? I know Peter was talking about, the history of great, mobilizations. And we should all remind ourselves that the largest mobilization ever in this country was the mobilization in New York against the war in Iraq, right? Which many of us forget was the largest mobilization in the history of the country, but it was. And it was a massive coalition that was built to basically oppose these neoliberal wars that were moving on. And I think explicitly sometimes and implicitly sometimes to critique the erosion of the social contract by the neoliberal economy and the wars that the neoliberal economy has actually fostered. Um, Now I think we're in a position where, because the social contract has been eroded, because there are no pillars of the social contract anymore, we are facing a rise in fascist thought. And fascism historically has always tried, I'm going to go back to the 30s, has always come in and tried to promise two things. We'll give you a job if you say, salute the president. And number two, we're gonna figure out how to find people housing. And the way that worked in terms of housing was in Germany was through invasion, right? Through expanding the homeland, right? Through finding ways to actually, displace and dislocate and commit genocide and actually place, the Germanic people in other places. And that I don't think we should take lightly the rhetoric of, taking over Greenland, taking over Canada, taking over the Panama Canal, because it flows from a very similar theory. It's the same theory that flows on the, expelling immigrants from this country, right? Very much the same theory. How do we create space for quote unquote true Americans who are going to make America great again? And so I think that the rise of fascism in the United States, I think, has heightened the concerns around a focus on militarization or military solutions to the quote unquote problems that the society faces that I think largely were economic problems driven through the expansion of neoliberalism through the 1990s and the early 2000s. So I think that leaves us, and I'll conclude, although I'm sure there'll be 7 million questions and corrections and et cetera. But I think that leaves us with what to do now. And I think two things. Number one, I think unions need to focus aggressively on becoming militant, on focusing on working with their members to get in the streets to fight for things our members care about. Because I do believe that on the other side of the things our members care about, right, those four things I mentioned, is the danger and the reality that much of the funding, in our tax dollar, increasingly more and more of our tax dollar goes to the military-industrial complex, and so you can't have a balanced social security system if you have a massive military-industrial complex, right? So there's these set of questions that I think are real, but we have to actually do the organizing for people to understand the self-interest in that. And so I think the way you do that is by focusing on points of conflict. Like we did that last year when we focused on our contract renewals in the hotel industry, and we had tens of thousands of people on strike across the country. So the second thing is I think we need to organize the unorganized. I think unions have been historically the strongest, most stable places in civil society to actually fight a good fight and to actually move people on major issues that are of interest to them. But too few people are members of unions now. And so I think we need to also be focusing aggressively on getting more people, younger people, into our unions, so they can have a space to link work with society, with politics, right? Because without that space existing, I think people are they fall into the traps of culture, right? That's where, fascism embraces a certain kind of working class culture and drives it as far as it can. And so I think that's another thing that's important. And then the last thing I would just say quickly, and then, let us get into a real discussion here, which is the most interesting piece, is I think we need to interrogate our politicians, right? I think too easily us in the labor movement, but I think many people, we have two choices often in this country, and it's like, let's choose what's the lesser of the two evils, right? And I think that's a bad place to go because you end up making very, very compromised choices, and you end up making compromised choices to back up political voices that in the end of the day don't represent the interest of our members in the union, and I think the people who vote for them by and large overall. And so I think that's the last thing we need to do, is to interrogate those political choices in some meaningful way. I don't think I have any of the solutions to this. Like I said, I think this is a great space to actually have this conversation. It's not a thing I get to do very often, but I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. And I really appreciated, Peter, all the things you had to say. It was super interesting. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Peter. That was those are two great presentations to kick this off. I do want to turn to audience questions, but before I do, I just wanted to maybe, stoke the coals a bit here by asking a couple of quick questions to you two. One thing you said, Peter, that interested me very much was, you said these two opportunities to, on the one hand, link militarization and to budgets and to the choices between welfare for people versus warfare for arms manufacturers. And on the other hand, the hypocrisy in the different treatments, for example, of Russia and Israel, when you look at what's going on in, say, Ukraine and Gaza, which, could be comparable, or at least certainly if you're going to make a big deal about Ukraine, you might want to make a big deal about Gaza as a bad thing. I guess what I'm asking is, those do seem somewhat at sort of at odds with each other. We have the same problem here, I think, in the peace movement. Gaza is a very clear outrage against humanity, and it's very clear that people want to do that, and it does anger people that is ignored by both Democrats and Republicans compared to, the support for the war in Ukraine. That there isn't a questioning of that. If anything, there's too much support for it. How do you reconcile those two things, though? Because the NATO push is all framed as a defense against Russia, and the Gaza thing, in some ways, is a defense of Palestinians against Israel. How do we put those two things together in your mind? I mean, you clearly are further down that road, I think, even than we are, but where do you see that?
On the right wing, they're using fear. On the Russia question in Europe, that's rapidly since 2022, that is, they are using fear. And the Russians will be in Brussels tomorrow. The same people are arguing the Russians will be tomorrow in Brussels, and this exactly the same people saying we will defeat the Russians. One of the two things can be true. But they, of course, they use this fear at this time. Europe has already 4 times as many warships than the Russians, 3 times as many tanks and artillery, 2 times as many fighter jets. And so we are discussing, okay, but having 8 times more warships and 4 times more tanks, etc. How could we be more secure? Because, for example, that's a discussion in Germany. Every new tank costs 28 billion euros. Opening a new primary school costs 28 million euros, not billion, million euros. It's exactly the same amount. And when now the German government is ordering 105 new Leopard tanks, so they can have 4 times as much tanks together with the Europeans against Russia. Okay, it's not investing in 105 primary schools, exactly the same amount. And so they're using the fear, and one side of the discussion is, okay, there is no Russian plan to invade Berlin. There is no Russian plan to invade Brussels. The other way around, the Russians, you can't argue about a lot, but they are afraid. They were just afraid that there was an enlargement towards their city, towards Moscow. That's the problem. Okay, that's a rational thing, but they're using fear on the one hand to do this, and also on the Palestinian way, they used racism. Let's be clear. There's a supporting of Israel against the Muslims. Right? There is this anti-Muslim rhetoric that's being used, but there is a backlash now on this the people. There was a part of the people who supported Israel also in Europe, also among workers. And now with this last hunger murder phase in Gaza, they are switching. That's what I'm saying. There are people switching, and I do think there's also people switching on the Ukrainian thing. The amount of people really believing that the European army can really defeat Russia is becoming less and less. And it is difficult to link to each other, but we say on a working class perspective, we have to continue to be, first of all, the best defender of the class interests of the working class. So that's why the strike at itself, it is about pensions, it is about healthcare. That's the base of that strike. But we are striking then to link these issues with the question of militarization on the one hand, and international solidarity on the other hand.
Mhm.
I don't know whether it's clear, but we're trying to merge these movements, but on the base of a struggle about pensions and healthcare. That's why.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's very well put. You know, that's the link. Certainly is in my unit. If there's going to be any link, it will be because we stand for the interests of the workers. Carlos, let me just throw a question at you too. I mean, you know, one of the things we talk about is we're in this terrible situation right now. But as you pointed out with Bill Clinton's presidency, a lot of the things that are threatening workers started then under a Democrat, under a liberal Democrat, you know, as he was characterized. And now, you know, we're facing decisions about big social programs, which he did not attack, like Medicaid or Medicare. Now they're under attack. But they're probably under attack because we are militarizing our economy. And yet all the talk is about it being purely a question of class. You know, the rich are getting tax breaks, the poor are getting their health care cut. How do we bring the military issue into that? Since it seems to me that's 1/3 of the equation, and you've sort of indicated that in how you've talked about it.
Yeah, look, I think the challenge of this whole discussion, right, is I have a thought on that myself, but the question is, how do you do the organizing to move the working class to understand the reality, right? I think that's the question I find the most challenging, right? Because I think, I'll pick on a sort of funny, sort of ridiculous example, right? Trump, was in the Oval Office, was like a week ago or whatever, talking about his like Star Wars version 17, right? Where he's going to spend a small fortune on Space Force putting, nuclear weapons in space, which is completely crazy. I think everyone here on this Zoom would probably agree that that's completely crazy. And I think, Harris, to your point, that same week there was just passing of the budget bill that has massive cuts to Medicaid and a number of other social entitlement programs, right? And so I think I don't know how much starker you're going to get than those two things happening simultaneously. And I think on top of that, right, from my perspective, but I think it's how do you do the organizing of, in my union, folks who clean rooms in hotels every day, right? The the continued funding of the military industrial complex in the United States, benefits the very same private equity and other investment capital vehicles that own the hotels, the major hotels in the whole world, in the U.S., but I just came from meeting everywhere. There's a direct correlation, right, between the kind of financialization of everyday life, which is really what, in my mind, is what neoliberalism has tried to do, right, and 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 any mechanism, and certainly the military is a very, 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 very strong mechanism to transfer wealth to global finance. And I think that that's something that is very much in the interest of, I would say, almost anyone who works for a living, uh, because at the end of the day, as wealth gets transferred, and whether that's through the exploitation of labor or whether that's through reallocating tax dollars to, Raytheon or whatever, all of that, I think basically takes income out of and whether that's direct income, right? Sort of my earned wages, right? Or whether that's future Social Security income, or whether that's Medicaid benefit, right? All of that is drawing from some other productive element in the society, right? And so I think those connections are real. I think the challenge I find is, and the big question is, how do you move folks? Because my experience, and I've been an organizer for a very long time, is no member wants to have some long political discussion when they're sitting in the cafeteria. That's not what they're interested in. They want to know, what's the contract going to do for them, right? And I think that's the challenge that we really face. But there is that interconnection is completely real. So
great. Well, that's both very congenial answers to where I think we're at. I'm going to turn it over to the audience now. I'd like to start with Joseph Garrison. You have a question, Joseph? You're muted, Joseph, or maybe you need to be unmuted by our tech people.
So first of all, thank you for organizing this. I really appreciate the contributions. I lived in Brussels a long time ago, and Peter, just to thinking on the anti-Muslim dimension here, I'm remembering that just below the Royal Palace was a statue to Godfrey de Bologna, which says he was the first king of Jerusalem, 1098 to 1100. And when he got there, he, of course, killed as many Muslims as he could, and Jews along the way. And part of me thinks that at some point Belgium's going to have to face that history. Just to say, I just got off of a planning call for counter NATO activities in The Hague in just over a couple of weeks. And one of the things that was said was that they are in the early stages of trying to organize events for September that would focus on the increased militarization of Europe, focused on EU militarization. And I think one of the challenges for us here in the U.S. will be to figure out how to relate to that, and if we can do something in solidarity when that comes around. I want to say, I guess two things. One is that it seems to me that ultimately to make progress as we face the fascist assault here, which affects everything that Carlos was laying out, but also the vast increase in militarization here, the focus on China, and it seems to me that we need to be thinking in terms of a possible general strike, which is not something which is generally discussed here in our culture. But it seems to me that given the force and power that the Trump MAGA have, and the possibility of the use of the military as well against us, that either in order to enforce one of the most critical Supreme Court decisions, or if they move to cancel the 2026 elections, we need to be prepared for a general strike. We have a long way to go for that. It seems to me that organized labor would be essential in it. And so I wanted to raise it here in this context, just to kind of keep people thinking or encourage people to think about that. Then finally, I'd like to ask Peter, we read here about basically almost a war fever in certainly in Western Europe. You talked about the fear in relationship to Russia. When I go to The Hague, I'm going to be in a little bit of a bubble of people opposed to NATO, and won't get an opportunity to hear what ordinary Europeans are saying, or not much of an opportunity. So it'd be helpful for me to get a clearer sense of how deep and wide the support for the massive militarization of Europe, maybe even the idea of ultimately building a third or a fourth superpower. Where is that discussion? What is it like on the streets?
Okay. Yeah, because NATO headquarters is in Brussels, right? And one of the discussion in NATO headquarters was, and they know it very much, we have the information via, but one of the discussion they said themselves is there is a problem, and that is that the basic peace sentiment of people is big. And they define it as a problem. And so they have laid out a strategy to win the public opinion via, of course, what is changing now rapidly the last year is before we had on the television channels journalists, or people that looked like journalists, but now they're generals on the television, and because they are specialists on the war, explaining, etc. That's totally in 2 years' time in Germany, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in France, in Italy, it changed. They are in the public space. It was never so the last since World War II. But they say themselves it won't be enough. And so they are trying to have influencers, TikTok channels, etc., etc. But at the base, they have a problem, and they say it themselves. I think the majority of the people, they are against war. So they're using fear of the war of the Russians. But in fact, I think at the base, the peace, the will of by the most of the people, I do agree with Carlos when he says about the contract and having the basic things. I think also salary, high health care, pensions, having the possibility that your children grow up in a world that is safe, like safety for themselves, etc. But also peace. I think the most of the people, they want to grow up in peace. They want to be left in peace, literally, and that's a big thing. But you have to know, Joseph, that what's happening in Europe at this time is it's rapidly changing. It's very new for the people, because there was this old peace movement in the 80s, but this discussion now is going the last year in a turmoil. The speed of the discussion is huge. I think for this moment, most of the people are against the Russians and somewhere fear still this Russians, but are in favor of peace. And when asked, for example, would they be willing to send their kids to the Ukrainian front? There was a survey in Holland, in the Netherlands. Netherlands is traditionally pro-NATO, very pro-NATO. And now 80% of the people in the Netherlands say, of 75, I don't know anymore. Yeah, of course, no, not my kids. And so this discussion about protecting the Ukrainian front, etc., against the Russian is not popular at all. And all these warmongering forces, they want to construct an extra layer of European army above the existing armies with 300,000 extra people. They don't find at this moment the soldiers. They are in the schools in Germany or the schools in the Netherlands, etc. They don't find enough voluntaries to go to. So I think globally, people in Europe are like everywhere, I presume, pro-peace, not to have this extra military layer. And there is a possibility. The main thing in Europe vis-a-vis Russia is fear, and to deconstruct the plans of Russia is an important thing. And when they will try to destroy the social security systems in Europe, the existing European social security system, I think there will also be turmoil in France and Italy, not only in Belgium. I don't know what. No.
No, I appreciate that. Right outside my window at my office downtown, there's a military parade going by, firing rifles and playing military music on. It's very appropriate somehow. But yeah, I think it's one of our annual celebrations of our glorious past. But anyway, did you want to add to that, Carlos? Anything that Peter was saying in response to Joseph?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to comment. I don't want to comment on the European perspective. I feel like I would certainly leave that to Peter. I think on this question of striking. Look, I think it's a great idea. I think the challenge is going to be having organized and been on many strikes. It is very, very challenging. So I just think we just got to be honest about the difficulty of it, and not to dismiss it as a tactic, obviously, but to be thoughtful about it. But I appreciate Peter's comments on the European context.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you also responded to that strike idea. I mean, I've been obsessively reading about the history of fascism and Nazism. I guess you call it a timely historical endeavor. But I mean, one of the things that's interesting, like in the book, The Nazi Seizure of Power, is how much the unions were a bulwark against against Nazism. They failed, but they were the only people who really took to the streets and tried to do something about the trade unions and the parties that supported them. It's a very depressing, but actually fairly heroic story in its in the last years of the Republic. And I think what Joseph said that's so interesting is that, a lot of people talk about a general strike in reaction to what's already happening, meaning they're arresting, ICE is arresting people on the street, and it's an outrage, no due process, very basic fascistic things are happening, the cuts to Medicaid. I mean, there are all kinds of things you could say were deserving of a mass response, all this breaking of traditions with the Constitution and how the government relates to institutions and things. However, Joseph made a good point. We haven't reached the breaking point at all where you could do that easily. As you say, Carlos, as an organizer, I'm like, really? I'm going to organize that? I mean, it sounds very grandiose, even despite the seriousness of where we are. And Joseph said, well, if they canceled the 2026 elections, yes, well, that's different, right? That's like now you're talking about that 1930 Germany kind of scenario, right? I mean, that is an interesting question. If we were really geared up to face something that serious, if things got that serious, would the labor movement be any kind of cornerstone? Because as you pointed out too, we're too weak to be, we're not the majority. And we're not even the majority or semi-majority we were back in the 1960s, let's say. Could we organize or work with others to organize a response that was that militant? I don't know. It's a wide open question, but I think Joseph is right to say what would motivate that hasn't happened yet. Does that make sense, Carlos? You're muted.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's an interesting question. I mean, look, I think, the yeah, I mean, I don't know how far down this road we want to go, but you know, we have successfully organized a number of strikes in our industry over the last 9 years. All of those have required significant preparation and significant work. All of those have been, and I think, this is where it's the sort of question you were just raising, Harris, I think is interesting. All of those have been we've been able to universally organize folks in a self-interested way, right? Which isn't to say that, like, people are all greedy, but right, everyone who went on strike, and we had very, very high levels of participation, 97, 98% in these strikes, right, of the workers, that we were able to organize folks from many perspectives, the self-interest in the action they were taking, because we should remind folks that, if unionized work, if workers go on strike in a context like we're describing, the consequences could be quite serious, right? And that's true even, under the normal rule of law, the consequences could be quite serious. So I just think it's something to be thoughtful about. So I don't know, that's just my perspective.
I absolutely agree. I do want to actually take a moment to just say, this is partly the result of the organizing work of a couple people at Mass Peace Action who are particularly concerned about getting the labor movement and working class people who are unorganized involved in the peace issue somehow, or how does that come about? And I just wanted to say Mary and Sarah is really the driving force behind this particular webinar. So I'm here playing the David Letterman or whatever, but I'm not the organizer of it. I want to give her credit for all the work she did to bring our two speakers here, and that's very valuable. And Rosemary Keene has her hand up, and I want to give the floor to her a moment because she's also organizing the committee within Mass Peace Action that's actually addressing this issue. So, Rosemary? You need to unmute, or Cole needs to unmute you. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you to Harris and our two speakers, Carlos and Peter. The discussion has been great. We've spent some time on the idea of national strike, and it was the other idea I was very interested in that was mentioned earlier was how do we organize the unorganized? I've heard that you only need 3.5% of the people in the street to make a big difference. And of course, we do have more than that unionized in the US, as low as our union membership is even now. But it seems to me we would do well to try to organize people who are not currently in unions. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts about steps 1 and 2 to do that.
Well, maybe could I even touch that question up a little? I think there's a question of what can we in labor do, to bring these issues together. And we've been talking about that, but also what can we those of us outside of labor do to help labor get stronger, to organize the unorganized? How can we do that, either helping the labor movement or doing it in other forms? So I don't know if our speakers can speak to that, because clearly Peter does it through another form, which is politics. And Carlos and I mainly do it through what you call a traditional trade union movement. So I'll turn that over, though, to the two speakers. I hope that is a helpful clarification, because I want to get at that too. Peter or Carlos? jump in?
Sure. I mean, I can say a couple of things. I mean, look, I think, we United Here Local 26 in the last 15 years has gone from 4,500 members to 14,000, maybe a little more members. So about 10,000 additional members in our union. I think, my answer is pretty. I always joke that organizing is very important but very boring. We dedicate a lot of resources to organizing. We work intensively to connect with workers in our industries in lots of different ways who are facing challenging situations at work, and try to figure out how to engage them and move them forward into the work of the union. And I think one of the great challenges in our labor movement in the United States, and I know it's very different in Europe, but the labor movement in the United States is very much challenged by the regime under which it operates, right? We are under constant pressure to service our membership and to not go seek out new members, right? And I can explain a lot of why that happens, and how that the dynamics of how that works in labor relations in the United States. But the entire legal regime is sort of set up under those premises. And so I think traditional unions, and I don't want to speak for worker centers, who I think do a lot of really good work in this area and stuff like that, I think need to make tough decisions to put their money where their organizing mouth is, and put a lot of resources into it. Because I think, at least our experience, and I know Harris's unions had a similar experience, is that when you do that, you can be successful. And when you don't do that, you generally are not successful. And so I think, and that's not to take away, again, like from other non-traditional forms of organizing, whether that's worker centers or organize. There's a lot of this idea now of trying to set up groups of folks who just try to organize organically. I think all of that is really, really positive. And I think there's folks who are trying to look for nonprofit funding for that, and I think that's good as well. But I think at the end of the day, it's very American, but I think it takes a lot of resources to organize. And you can have the best argument in the world or the best ideology in the world, and it doesn't matter if you're not actually out there knocking on doors, going to work sites, finding those contacts, following up those contacts, training people to face down the fear that people have, training people to face down anti-union campaigns. My experience in every union campaign I've been in is, if you have a significant majority, it could take you years, but you always win, right? It's just, I got one. We just had one of these just happen that went on 3 years, and we won after 3 years. Why? Because we maintained that significant majority. And so, again, I do think it's a bit of a boring answer, but it's certainly my experience of it. And I think, we got to encourage any organization that's interested in organizing to put the resources towards doing it.
Peter, do you want to address that? And also, I mean, particularly, you want to address it from why you do it through a political means as opposed to a trade union means to really reach out to the working class. Because that's something we don't really have here in the United States. We don't have
I think
working party workers.
On that level, I think it's more easy here, because like we are a left-wing party, working class party, having a voice in parliament, having a megaphone to some extent in the media, only to some extent, but still we have it. So that's more easy than in the bipartisan political landscape. Okay, there are differences. No, I think we call it this three axes for working class politics, meaning organize, educate, mobilize. This is the main three tasks as we see it for working class people to be done. And we have a lot of discussions. I said a little bit about romanticism, because there is a generation, even my generation, but also the generation before, the balance of forces since the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, it didn't went in the good direction. And then you can look back and say, back in the days, we were more powerful there and more powerful globally, etc. Okay, and that is interesting, but I don't think, or we don't think in our experience, we will attract people with this kind of discourse. On the other hand, I do believe that schooling the working class history and the victories and the context is one of the answers. It's only an answer to do it, because sometimes I think in the European condition of the 19th century, when the first trade unions were created and working class parties were created, the circumstances, they were as bad and even more worse than today. People couldn't read, 14-hour days, not as, but no right to strike. And they built their dream to construct trade unions. They built their dream to construct. It was done in a difficult times, and we are in difficult times. It is not a concrete answer, but I think the ideology of those who are working in working class areas, you have to do it with a perspective to win, like Carlos said, because in my opinion, also as a politician, people can sense if you do it like for a 9 to 5 hour job, or if it's with your heart. People can hear that when you're honest, working class. I cannot explain it with language, but my experience, people really feel when someone committed is doing the work, or is some bureaucrat, etc. And so organize the organizers, educate the organizers, share all the positive experiences, and not only the defeats, but also the small experiences. I think there's no other way around that. That's bottom-up construction work. But I do believe that history is not one linear line. In time of crisis and turmoil, when things are well prepared, it can go fast. We have some situations where, like in the hospital, no one expects, and then there is a movement. It can go fast. It's not one linear movement, but bottom-up work, the construction work, the organizing work. Yeah, okay, it's a long time per second. There's also a strike I want to add, because the general strike, I come from a country where there's more tradition to the general strike, and that's good. I like it, but don't idealize it. It's not because people are going on strike one day for the pensions that you're conscient at the same day. The education part has to be done still, but I do agree that intersectoral general strike is a lot of advantage. I am not. But the general strike doesn't bring automatically conscience. There are people in France. France is the country where there's the most of strikes. But half of the people going on strike, they vote Front National. They vote extreme right. Yeah. Okay. That's.
Yes. Okay. Well, good point. Okay, Jeffrey, do you want to ask a question?
I hope you don't mind, but I got a few. One for Cole, one for Peter, one for Carlos, and then one for everyone. I hope you don't mind, do you?
Jeffrey, don't ask a question to me. I'm not on the panel today. Focus your questions on the presentations of the panel, please.
Okay. Oh, I just wanted. All right. All right. First off, for Peter, when you said it will destroy social security system, does that include the destruction of the U.S. Social Security Administration, or did I misunderstand what you said?
Yeah, I was talking about the classical European social security system, and there will be a big attack on that in the next 5 years. I'm not pronouncing myself about the US situation. It's up to you to analyze that. I was talking about the European situation.
Right. And Carlos, I wanted to say, are you serious that Clinton fired more than Elon Musk?
Yeah, in the second the downsizing of the federal government, in the budget wars of the second term of the Clinton administration, there were more federal jobs lost than have been lost so far under the Trump administration. Now Trump's got 3 more years, so let's be 3.5 more years. But yeah, that's actually true. Yeah.
Sometimes I wonder what history would have been if someone different than Clinton was president. You know what I mean? They could have avoided that.
Yep.
Yeah. And for everyone, like you said, if he cancels the election, like you said, that could put himself in as an authoritarian type figure, which could provoke the people into wanting to start a second American Revolution or a second Civil War to throw Trump and his loyalists out of power, literally out of power. You know, do you think I make a point there, or doing?
Well, I think that's the question. We don't know where we're headed with all that, but I have to say he's done more. I mean, like his one big beautiful bill act. Somebody explained to me that it's written that way, so it's really hard to Google it and get information about it because it's like a string of word salad. But I don't know if that's true or not. But one of the things that one of my folks in the DC in the SEIU said that is the largest bill passed in the shortest time in American history. So this is a guy who does very bold and dangerous policy changes very, rashly. And so I guess we have to be ready for anything.
That's why to help counteract stuff like that and prepare people, like to rise up. I created some stuff that I wanted Massachusetts Peace Action to help sponsor.
Okay, we'll share that in the chat, or with one of the organizers afterwards. I did want to open the floor to another question from Wahalabi.
That's why
Wahalabi.
Yeah. So this is Wadir Halabi with the Communist Party. I'm Palestinian, born in Palestine, driven out in 1948 in Nakba, and ended up in Gaza. And from there, in Egypt, in war, 56 Suez War, driven out of Egypt into Lebanon in civil war. And you learn that the world is very changeable, can change either way, and it can be very rapid. And part of the work I've been doing for some time is on the material basis for revolutionary optimism in this period. And we are in an extraordinary historical period that can be compared to, say, what started with a crisis in 1907, world crisis, and led to many defeats, but also the victory of the Russian Revolution and revolutionary explosions in Germany, in Italy, and beyond that stopped that World War. Same thing, say, with the crisis that led to the victory of revolution in Vietnam and China. And I really want to thank the Napa Labor Working Group for organizing this very significant meeting, in my opinion, with Brothers Mertens and Aramoya and Grumman to bring together this group. And actually wanted to add to the introduction of Brother Mertens, that's basically that thanks to the remarkable struggles led by the Workers' Party of Belgium, it's a member of SolidNet, Solidarity Network, an organization most people have never heard of. And yet that, in my opinion, is key to revolutionary optimism. What SolidNet does is it brings together a little more than 120 communist and Workers' Party, the Workers' Party of Belgium being one of them, with a total membership of 110 million. And the reference point for all these parties are not the weaknesses and serious errors, including on Palestine, that have led to the defeats we've suffered, especially in the past 50 years, collapse of the Soviet Union, defeats of what should have been revolutions in Lebanon in 76, in Iran 3 years later, in South Africa. But it's the theory and the organization, the social base in the working class, above all the proletariat, and the practice that led to the victory of the Russian revolutions and subsequent revolutions. And not least, there are 420 million workers in unions openly affiliated with the Communist and Workers' parties in Solidarity Network. And right now, these parties and unions, we can't say, are particularly effective, sometimes in specific struggles. And this is in part where Gaza comes in, is what imperialism is doing in Gaza is just so outrageous. It comes out of its growing weakness, but it's so outrageous that it's an opening to rejoin the world labor movement in action. So that's part of where the optimism comes in. 420 million workers in unions affiliated with SolidNet. And effectively, that's part of a question to Brother Mertens, is the assessment of what are the stronger parties in SolidNet based on your experience, and the stronger unions, and because what Gaza provides an opening for, unlike any major crisis, in my opinion, conditions in big parts of Africa are worse than in Gaza, parts of Congo or Niger, but it's not obvious what the enemy is. But in Gaza, it's obvious who the enemy is and who's behind this, and it opens that door for united labor action to block imperialism. And I think with mass mobilizations behind it, but where the working class takes leadership. And
Brother Halabi, why don't we let Peter respond to that, because those are excellent points. I'd like to hear his perspective on that actual organizing effort among parties and unions. See what he has to think. But thank you for that.
Thank you, comrade, for the questions. And first of all, let me state our point is, from our perspective, that the tectonic plates of the world are changing. Mainly, the shift economically is going to Asia and to China and the rise of India. It is happening. Whatever emotion we can have about it is happening. And so in my point of view, what the US is doing since Obama, since it pivoted to Asia, and then afterwards everyone continues one way or another, is a reaction about the strong economic growth in China and in India. It is a reaction on every way. And so this new Cold War that the US wants to impose against China, that's one driving point of this century. And Europe is losing in all this history. And everything is rapidly changing, militarily, ideologically, and for the first time, because 500 years, the Europeans thought they were the center of the world, and that the meridian was right through of all Europeans. And now, so all of a sudden, is completely changing. And the context is chaos. The context is completely changed of the situation. The disadvantages, it can be go to the right, and normally in this chaos, if there is no conscience, it will go to fascist tendency, and every thief selling his own little story about the Muslim here and etc. The most positive thing in this period is that what is small can become big rapidly, and the other way around. I'm really completely, I'm a fan of dialectics. I really think it works like that. And the condition of becoming big is that you have a good leadership, a democratic leadership, but also a unified leadership, a good orientation, and a good class oriented practices. So these small organizations or more smaller organization in SolidNet and everywhere else that have that, I think they can grow. So it's not a question of numbers only. It's also a question about who has the potential to grow. And I think also on revolutionary optimism it's important to see, like if you have in every factory, you need one or two convinced people to unionize the others. You need this one of two pearls, this potential leaders. If you have them, it can go fast, but you have to start with it. And so the second thing we practice is we can learn from each other. Really, we need to learn from each other. We need to steal from each other. And so our point of view is not only to work in SolidNet, not only to work with the communist parties, but also to work with the broad working class movement. And let's learn to learn from each other, because the times are so chaotic. So let's learn wherever there is possibility to learn more. I can describe the whole situation of the left in Europe, but I don't think it's the goal.
Well, I think those are good framework sort of to start to wrap things up too, because we are nearing time. Carlos, did you have sort of a final thoughts you wanted to share based on either what you just heard or in general of this conversation?
Yeah, look, this is a bit of a tangent, although maybe not that much from what we just talked about, which, look, I do think global solidarity is very important, and the spaces that encourage global solidarity are very important. And I think if they weren't very important, they wouldn't be under so much attack, right? And so I think there's a strong pressure on everyone, right, to focus on the problems right in front of them rather than to think about global solidarity. And I think whenever you do that, whenever one does that, whether personally or institutionally, I think you run the danger of playing into the politics of the right? Because you end up kind of stopping thinking about the world as a world of people who, I'm one of these people who fundamentally believes, I think maybe Peter and I believe a lot of the same things. I'm one of these people who fundamentally believes that a housekeeper down the street at the Park Plaza has more in common with a housekeeper in Brussels than they do with, their boss who works in the same building, right? And that's really, I think, fundamentally important to the sort of fundamental basis on which solidarity operates, I think is really important for the future world ahead that I think we all hope for when there's real peace. And so I think, first of all, just exchanges like this are really important. Spaces like this, I think, are really important to be able to kind of engage in what Peter was just talking about, this ability to try to talk with as many people in as many ways as possible to try to actually organize the working class in a way to kind of push towards that bigger future. I do think this other thing that was raised by several people about kind of the conjecture, I would say, that we're in right now, right? Not to get all like Brodell or whatever, but I think, I think we are in this middle of this great conjecture, which is the sort of moment of quickening, right? Like when that happens, there's a moment of historical quickening. And I think that's the moment when the actions of individuals and organizations start to matter much more than they do in sort of the long curves of history, right? And that is, and I think, Peter was very articulate about the situation in Europe. I think all of us are living day in and day out, right? You open up the newspaper every morning and it's a different set of crazy things that are happening, right? I think we're all facing that at the same time. And I think in those moments, right, it is a great contest, right? But between where will the world go? Where will humanity go? Where will the economy go? Where will society go? Where will we go towards peace, or will we go towards war? And I think these are the moments in which sort of individual and collective actions start to matter the most. And it's the moments when you can, turn the dialectic on its head, right? And so I do think there is an urgency right now for us to double down on all the work we're doing and to find ways to encourage the working class and working people to find hope in the message that I think we're all trying to bring. Because I think the economic conditions that, sort of started with talking about in sort of big space, they do favor us winning if we do the work. but there's certainly people on the other side who are trying to have a different outcome. And I think that's the challenge that I think we really have to try to find ways to answer today. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and have this discussion. So
yeah, I appreciate you. Peter, anything final you want to say in addition to what you said?
Yeah, thanks also for listening to this European point of view. And it was interesting for me also what Carlos said, but also the questions, because it make you think about how to cope with things. With the 2026 problem that someone raised here, I think for us it's the same thing also, I think, in Europe. So you can have leaders, right-wing leaders, authoritarian leaders, and there is an anti-democratic stance, like what ISIS is doing. From what we hear about it here in Europe, it's completely fucked up, this arrests, etc., and the movement against it. Also this pro-rich, this new tax cuts for the rich that Trump is, and so anti-democratic, pro-rich. But the question is, in the public, in the broad public thing, that's a question I have. Are these people also seen, like Meloni or Trump or Orban, as anti-working class? And like what we are trying to do in Europe is also trying to bring together these three elements. They are pro-elite, they are anti-democratic, but they are also anti-working class. Because there is also a current in Europe that say, okay, no matter that he's elitistic, no matter that it's anti-democratic, as long as he is or she is in favor of the working class. Do you know what I mean? There's also try to build that image of this kind of leader, but okay, they're anti-working class, and it's not exactly the same as pro-rich, and not exactly the same as anti-democratic or pro-war. And if we can, one way or another, tie all these things together, there will be the power of the majority. I think that can win.
Well, I really appreciate that, and we want to continue this conversation within MAPA, and of course within the movement as a whole, and within our unions. I think we've heard a lot of good ideas about how we should think about helping the unions achieve their goals, which is to organize the working class and to give them a form, because we know that is better than the alternative. It always is better than the alternative. You can't have democracy or a working class politics without a mediating organization that gives it form, and that takes real organizing. So that's a good thing. I think tying the terrible cuts to people's everyday life, like we talked about, in the European sense, the social security system in whatever forms it takes, is a very real self-interested thing people need to face up to, and that should bring in the question of military expenditures at some point. That's a hard road to go still here in America, but it is it's an important element. So I think we have a lot of good ideas to percolate on, but I really appreciate you two coming on and speaking. It's been very inspiring, I think. So thank you, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you.